This is DGMT's Learning Lunch, and I'm your host, Rahima Esop. In April 2022, a seemingly banal thing happened that set the path for big things to follow. The Social Development Minister handed over responsibility for overseeing early childhood development to the Basic Education Minister. Now, for those who've been waiting for this to happen, it was a big deal that would quickly lead to even bigger changes. Fresh political will to improve access to early learning and a willingness to work with social partners. Less than 2 years later, in command of her new role, the Basic Education Minister instructed her department to roll out a mass registration drive to bring approximately 22,000 unregistered early learning programs into the fold. This presented a window of opportunity to unlock state subsidies for children in poorer communities attending early learning programs. It's a policy window, in the words of scholar John Kingdon, that NGOs are seizing by working with the government. So to talk about what it took to get to this point, what this opportunity means for children and ECD practitioners, and how social partners are working with the government to seize this opportunity, I'm joined by Kyan Schultz, who's the process design lead for the mass registration drive. Welcome, Kyan. It's so nice to have you.
Thanks, Rahima. It's so lovely to be here.
Kyan, there's so much to cover here, but I want to start with a question that will help us to understand why this mass registration drive is such a big deal for the ECD sector, especially if we look at what census data tells us about the number of children who are eligible to receive state subsidies, but are not actually getting it.
Thanks, Rahima. As you mentioned, this has been something that's been a long time in the coming. When I started my job in 2012, I was starting working with ECD programs that were struggling to get registered. And many ECD programs, not NGO organizations across the country, have been working for many, many years against this challenge of registration and a lack of state support for ECD programs. This is a really exciting opportunity where we can get alignment across government, civil society, and ECD programs themselves, where we can all focus on a shared goal. And I think your point is an important one, that ECD programs are under-supported. They do critically important work. We know that about 90% of brain development takes place before the age of 5. And thus, it's incredibly important from an equity perspective that ECD programs are receiving state subsidies and they are able to support young children. We also know that about a third of ECD programs are receiving subsidization. And that obviously isn't sufficient. That means that parents pay incredibly high fees that they can't afford in order to send their children to ECD programs. It means that many children can't attend ECD programs at all. And there are children who unfortunately don't have a safe or stimulating environment to learn. And that has significant impact through the schooling system, but also just generally in terms of future life outcomes.
Kyan, I think it would be useful for myself as well as the audience if you get us up to speed. How has the work of various social partners laid the foundation for what is happening and is about to happen with the mass registration drive?
It's important to start by saying the work of registration has really been led by mostly women who run ECD programs and then civil society for many, many years. But in recent history, we've also had some really exciting policy work. We've had work from partners that DGMT works with, such as Ilifa Labantwana, helping to support essentially identifying opportunities for conditional registration of ECD programs. Other partners, such as the Nelson Mandela Foundation and Impande, in leading a mass registration drive called Vangasali. And now we're building on that work with this Banapele mass registration drive that the department are now leading. And it really has taken years and years of insight in terms of the barriers of registration, both at a national and municipal level, to come to this point where we have a solution that feels much more streamlined than previous solutions.
What is the difference between registration and conditional registration?
Great question, Rahima. So full registration under the Children's Act is what is required in order to be fully registered by government. It's a longer term process. So full registration typically has a 5-year period. that you can operate when you receive that registration certificate. It also indicates that there aren't improvements that you need to make. What conditional registration does is it's a developmental process that allows you to understand what needs to happen in order for you to be registered fully by government. And conditional registration always requires that there are changes that you make. So full registration really allows an ECD program to sort of understand that they meet all the minimum standards, that they are fully compliant, whereas conditional registration shows that there are particular identified areas of change that would be required.
And within the informal ECD sector, would you say that most ECD practitioners are kind of aiming for conditional registration because that might be the easiest to go for right now?
It's a really great question, is what proportion of ECD programs can get fully registered at current levels. And it's helpful to understand that full registration requires compliance with the Children's Act, but it also requires compliance with the National Environmental Health Norms and Standards and compliance with local municipal bylaws. And so it can be very, very difficult to get compliance under all of those different systems. So what conditional registration allows for is progress towards that. And I think it certainly is true that there aren't that many ECD programs that seem likely to be able to get full registration straight away. It's likely that most ECD programs will require some support to get to that full registration status.
Was conditional registration always an offering from government, or did conditional registration become an offering thanks to social partners like Ilifa, Labantwana and others that were involved in advocacy and kind of building the systems for a more simplified registration process?
For a long time, there's been a recognition that full registration under the Children's Act is difficult and that conditional registration is required. And there's been a lot of work since back to 2017 when there were processes for conditional registration, but it wasn't necessarily clearly articulated how to organize that conditional registration, let me say. Then in 2019, the Vangasali mass registration drive helped to combine both program and partial care registration processes and sort of streamline the process for applying for registration. But at that time, the process was quite difficult. We were looking at sort of a 100-page document that you needed to receive. You needed to complete many forms and templates. And this is just registration under the Children's Act. You would also need to still complete municipal processes for your sort of environmental health norms and standards and fire safety and so on and so forth. So the conditional registration process it's certainly been something where a variety of social partners have been advocating to simplify it, and the implementation of it has really been something where there's been partnership between government and social partners.
Thanks, Kyan. I feel like I have a better understanding of the work that has gone into making registration a little easier for early learning programs since, let's say, 2017. Fast forward now to 2024, the former Minister of Basic Education instructed her department to register approximately 22,000 unregistered early learning programs. But the department realized that it could not do it on its own. Instead, they formed a social compact with civil society partners to make this happen. What strengths and expertise do the different players bring to the table, and why is this social compact so interesting and also so important?
This is so exciting. For many of us who work in the civil society space, opportunities to partner with government they are reasonably rare. And these opportunities, they provide an opportunity to use the best of both worlds. Government has the scale, the budget, the staff in terms of implementation to really take processes like this and help them to succeed. But the social partners often have things that are very important as well, such as relationships with ECD programs, some level of flexibility in terms of their design and some of their budgets as well. There's also the opportunity really to take the knowledge and materials that they've developed and support government processes. And so in this case, what's really exciting is that we've seen, I think, some of the skills that we really need in our public policy, which include things like simplifying processes and procedures, really good graphic design, technological capabilities to use things like online tools, things like WhatsApp, things like call centers, things that the for-profit sector often are more acknowledged to use, that really government can benefit from using to really help provide blanket support and some materials that are user-friendly and can actually be used by ECD programs. We've also seen support in terms of ensuring that the messages land in communities. I think it can be important that government communicates messages at a national level, but in order for those to reach communities that are sometimes in rural areas, sometimes aren't necessarily plugged into sort of mainstream media communications, those messages sometimes have to be communicated through trusted networks. And that's also been absolutely crucial in seeing some of the successes that we've seen.
Kyan, I think it would be useful to give us a sense of who are these social partners? Who's involved in this?
So there's a range. We need partners at multiple levels. We obviously need partners in communities. And so here we're talking about a range of organizations that we're calling support organizations. These organizations are often ECD, sometimes called resource and training organizations, ECD support organizations, often that have existed for many years. They're partnering with us in ensuring that the implementation, that applicants are supported, that they use application materials, that they're able to access the online forms, and that they get all the support that they need. We also see partners in actually helping to plan and implement some of these processes. We've seen partners coming on board in terms of ensuring that there's funding, partly for ensuring that this process can roll out nationally, but also that we can get materials that are important for ECD programs if they need to be registered. So some of those organizations include Ilifa Labantwana, Nelson Mandela Foundation, Impande, DGMT, of course, and we've seen many partnerships at many different levels for this project.
Kyan, I mentioned John Kingdon a little earlier, and his theory goes that a significant policy shift happens when three things are in place. First, there must be a problem that is well understood. There must be a viable and feasible solution ready to address that problem. And there must be political will to deal with the problem. If we have to apply that theory to the context of the mass registration drive, have you seen that theory in practice?
Yeah, I think in my time in the sector, this is a really good example of that theory coming to fruition. We've seen that essentially all the pieces are in place for this next year, essentially, to be the year where mass registration drive really shifts in South Africa in a fundamental way. And I think, as you say, it is because, on the one hand, there were a range of social partners who'd been working on tools and materials, but who were also flexible enough to be able to both understand this opportunity and then meet the moment in shifting their practices in order to ensure that this moment really does change things in South Africa. Secondly, obviously, it is really important to have that buy-in from national government, to have that sort of shared understanding across different levels of the sector, from national government to provincial government to municipal government, which is also an incredibly important area where a lot of partners have been working to shift municipal buy-in for registration for a number of years. And that is another important part of this work. So in essence, I think the Kingdon theory of policy windows is a really good one for understanding what this opportunity is for the mass registration of ECD programs.
Kyan, up until this point, we've done a fair amount of much needed contextualizing, but tell me what's been happening since the beginning of the year? Where are we with the mass registration drive?
So the mass registration drive has rolled out the first stage in Gauteng. We call this the bronze stage, where applicants are invited to apply. They have to complete an application form, and if they complete everything as indicated and they commit to meeting 15 basic health and safety standards, they receive a bronze registration certificate. We've seen over 2,500 applications coming in Joburg in the last few months, and we are in the process of rolling out across the country. So we are having conversations about rolling out in other provinces currently.
And just to be clear, the bronze certification is for conditional registration.
Yes, one of the new introduced processes as part of the Banapele mass registration drive is that we've adapted the old conditional registration framework, which had a bronze, silver and gold stage, but we've introduced a new set of requirements for the bronze stage. The bronze certificate enables an ECD program to operate for 12 months from the period of registration, and essentially provides them with a period that they can use to get to either silver, which would be a longer term conditional registration, or gold, which would be full registration.
Kyan, what makes this mass registration drive different from its predecessors? One predecessor, Vangasali, you mentioned in your introduction. What's different?
It's a great question. And I think, we have to be humble and we have to learn from what's gone before. Vangasali was, really excellent attempt to really massify registration. Unfortunately, we recognize that massifying registration is incredibly difficult. It requires a lot of resources. It requires a lot of political buy-in. It requires kind of consistent support across the ECD sector. And so what we are seeing now is that we're able to build from some of those learnings that we experienced through the Vangasali process. We're also able to use some really exciting new tools that have become available. So things like the eCares online registration platform that Ilifa Labantwana were working on in partnership with the Department of Basic Education. That has really assisted us with having a new online application system that applicants can use to manage their application process. We've streamlined several of the processes. As I mentioned earlier, we had sort of 100 pages of handbooks and tools that ECD programs were needing to complete in order to start the registration process. We've simplified that down by about a third, and we are really trying to reduce the amount of documents that need to be submitted to provinces by streamlining some of the processes. As I mentioned, we introduced this new bronze stage, which gives people an entry point into the application system. That's really important because we don't want ECD programs to sit outside of the registration system for long periods of time. What we want them to do is enter that support process, be identified when they don't meet the minimum standards for what those support needs are. And so we've created a readiness assessment tool that's helping to give ECDs the information that they need in order to understand what they need to get registered. And that can also help local NGOs and local donors to understand what support that they can provide to ensure those ECDs can get registered. So we're trying to increase the transparency of the process. Maybe lastly, I'll say, as I mentioned earlier, we're really learning from what works in other sectors. So here's where we're learning from. The use of a call center is really, really valuable in terms of sharing information with ECD practitioners, but also making sure that people receive information in the comfort of their home, particularly if they don't have access to the internet. The call really helps the applicant to receive the information they need, regardless of whether or not they are in a rural area or in an urban area. We also have tools like WhatsApp, basically communication tools that can really massify information sharing. And we've really seen that's been really helpful in encouraging people to apply for the mass registration process.
Kayan, to summarize what you've just said, reducing barriers to entry, fewer documents, more support for ECD practitioners, moving from a paper-based system to an electronic system are some of the measures that are being implemented during the mass registration drive. My question is, why haven't these things been done earlier? Why now? And that perhaps goes to the heart of today's conversation, which is about policy windows. So what makes this moment different?
I think what we had with the minister's announcement earlier this year is a moment where we could align the interests of multiple stakeholders in the ECD sector. We had really clear communication that encouraged departmental officials to support mass registration of ECD programs. We had donor organizations who'd been working for years to try and support registration. We had civil society partners and ECD programs who had already been in the trenches working on this day in and day out. And I think the last thing, and I didn't mention this in the previous answer, is that there's also a willingness to support ECD programs to get registered. It's not just about them starting the journey, but they also do need support in the sector. And we do have that kind of collective buy-in from many partners in order to provide that support.
So what will make this a success? It's already underway and targets have been set for the next 6 months and beyond. What will make this a success?
Yeah, we're very focused on the goal. The goal here is to register thousands of ECD programs. And so we have, targets for rollout across different provinces. We are aiming to get 18,000 bronze registrations as soon as possible. This obviously requires provincial support in rollout. But I think what we want to do is get basically all ECD programs that are unregistered into that starting point. The next step, obviously, is to make sure that they're progressing through the registration system. And that is the next hurdle, is to make sure that they're receiving the materials and information they need in order to move through that registration process, that social work site inspections are taking place, that that materials that are needed in order to meet those minimum norms and standards are being received by ECD programs, and that they are actually then meeting those minimum norms and standards. And ultimately what we want to do is see those 18,000 ECDs that start this process moving to conditional or full registration, so what we would call silver or gold registration. Then lastly, I would say what we do want is to see that driving government support. So at the moment, as I mentioned at the top, very few ECDs are subsidized. I think it's in the region of around 600,000 children are receiving the subsidy. What we would like to see is increased budgeting for supporting the newly registered ECD programs. And we know that registration is required in order to put that pressure on bids to government to increase the subsidy allocation. So ultimately, we would like to then also see increases in subsidization of children from ECDs that serve poor children who meet the minimum norms and standards and who are eligible for the subsidy.
Kayan, you mentioned a little earlier that in Gauteng around 2,500 early learning programs were targeted. What can we expect over the next few months?
So we would expect to see new provinces starting the registration process. So basically, we would see increased applications for registration from across the country. And by the end of the year, we would hope that all provinces have the new registration system live and applications are coming in. We would expect to see an increase in what we call silver and gold registration from early next year. And ultimately, that will then impact who can then apply for the subsidy and then receive that.
How can other civil society organizations and donor organizations, for that matter, get behind this particular project?
We are always looking for additional support, so it's really important that people do feel like they can participate. This project will be successful if there is broad societal support for it, and it'll obviously struggle more if there isn't. As we roll out in a province, we share information with civil society organizations. We ask them to apply to be a partner to support the project, and there are 2 roles that they can take on in doing that. For those who do take on a partner support role, we provide them with all the tools and materials that they'll need in order to support implementing the registration process. For donors, we encourage them to reach out to the project management unit team if they're interested in supporting this work, and we will be in touch. But also there are opportunities for smaller donors, for example, to work on a more local basis to help support the process in their local communities. And what that means is investing in ECD programs that are struggling to meet the registration requirements, but to ensure that they're actually using the mass registration drive process and materials and supporting those partners at that level.
Kayan, I just want to pause there for a second. You mentioned that civil society organizations are being brought on as implementing partners. What type of organization are you looking at specifically to be part of the mass registration drive?
So we have 2 types of partners. We call them the communications partner and the support partner. For the support partner, we're looking mostly for organizations that have a bit of a history in the ECD sector. These might be organizations that provide training. They might be providing existing registration support. Perhaps they're working on infrastructure for ECD programs. These are the kinds of organizations that often have existing networks, as well as the kinds of skills that are really valuable in supporting ECD programs in their registration journey. The second partner that we look at is called a communication partner. And here what we're looking for is basically organizations that have some kind of network in the ECD sector and who can share our messaging, who can share the materials that we're sharing widely. And so when it comes through a trusted source, that those ECD partners believe the messaging, trust it, and actually take on the registration process. So there may be other opportunities to support the registration drive. And for those more customized opportunities, I would really recommend reaching out to the project management unit team, and those can be discussed specifically.
Great. You've mentioned that before. How would people get hold of the project management team?
I run what's called Early Learning Program Enablement. So I'm the contact person for a lot of civil society organizations that are trying to partner with registration. So you can reach out to me at Kayan, Kayin, at dgmt.co.za. That's one of the ways. There are a few other mechanisms, but I think that'll be the easiest for these partners.
It's still early days, Kayan, but what have you learned from your experience of working with the government that other civil society organizations can benefit from?
I think it's such an important question, and one I really want to start with is just there are good people within government who are doing incredibly difficult work, and they are working really long hours and under really difficult conditions. And the work that they do really matters. For most South Africans, it's the work that government does that's going to have the biggest impact on their lives. So as a starting point, I think it's that the work that government does is important and that we need to partner with them if we want to see large-scale societal changes. The second thing is that government, they do have clear goals in terms of what their goals are. Those goals are shared through everything from sort of national annual plans through to sort of medium-term plans. These documents are really helpful for people who want to partner with government because they give you the opportunity to understand what government's priorities are, and they give you a way to align your work with what government is planning. The third thing is that government has some limitations in terms of both budget and in terms of flexibility. And civil society can really come to the party here. This is where the smaller organizations with more flexibility and resources that they've been developing over years can really be helpful to government because they provide that much needed flexibility, that ability to be responsive to particular challenges. There's also some innovative solutions that often come from the civil society sector. And I think when it's aligned around a shared goal, that can really be quite a powerful solution.
And is it even possible to prepare for a policy window? What advice can you share with our civil society audience? How does one prepare for a policy window? I mean, do you just sort of keep on going and hope that one opens up?
Yeah, I think there are two questions in that. The one is, can you open policy windows? And there is a level to which sort of small changes that organizations can make can support the ultimate opening of a policy window. The second thing is, what can you do to make sure that when a policy window opens that you're ready? And I think here it's about, as I sort of mentioned earlier, it's about really having a good understanding of how government works. And that means things like understanding which departments are responsible for which things, whether it's a national responsibility, a provincial responsibility, a municipal responsibility. Understanding some of the players in that space is also very helpful. And then I think it's really about making sure that you're well prepared, both in terms of having a clear understanding of the problem you're trying to solve, a clear understanding of your particular solution and what is powerful about that solution. And I think a good track record of implementation is really helpful. It makes it a lot easier for government to then understand what the solution could look like and how they could support the process. So I think that also speaks to some level of documentation and kind of rigor in development.
Essentially building up that evidence. Thank you, Kyan. We've seen how timing, preparation, and a deep understanding of the policy landscape can come together to create real change for the ECD sector and our country's children. Thank you for joining me to talk about the mass registration drive, and all of the best as you go ahead.
Thanks, Rahima. Thanks for having me. And yeah, excited to partner with everyone. Looking forward to seeing this as a successful project.
And now over to you, those listening to this podcast. Using what you have heard today, you can try this reflective exercise. You'll need a pen and paper to write down these steps or download the takeaway sheet from our website. Write down the following questions and spend some time reflecting on them by yourself, and then share your reflections with your colleagues. Question number 1. Is your organization interested in working with government? Question number 2. How prepared is your organization to take advantage of policy windows at a national, provincial, or local level? And question number 3. What steps can you take to ensure that you are ready to partner when the opportunities arise? This was DGMT's Learning Lunch. Until next time.